David, a 14-year-old boy, faced constant bullying and racism at school. His life seemed hopeless until he formed an unexpected bond with a mysterious wolf. What happened next will leave you speechless. Stay tuned to learn the incredible story of how this friendship changed everything. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to the channel for more amazing stories. David Kimber, a 14-year-old boy, lived in a small, predominantly white town in Idaho. Being one of the very few black families in the area, David and his mother often faced the subtle, lingering stares of neighbors. His mother worked long hours at the local diner, leaving David to navigate school and life largely on his own. Though his mother always reassured him of his worth and brilliance, David couldn't escape the reality of being treated as an outsider. At school, things were even worse. David's classmates bullied him mercilessly. His dark skin became the target of cruel jokes, insults, and even physical altercations. Every day felt like a battle just to get through. They'd call him names like Midnight or Shadow, and mockingly ask him if he could even see himself in a mirror. If he tried to defend himself, they'd corner him after school and make him regret it. Teachers either looked the other way, or worse, scolded David for causing trouble. Over time, he learned to keep his head down, hoping to avoid their wrath. One day, during lunch, a group of boys decided to push things further. They snatched his tray and dumped his food on the floor, laughing as they told him to pick it up like a good boy. David clenched his fists, his face burning with anger and humiliation, but he said nothing. As he bent to clean the mess, one of them shoved him, sending him sprawling onto the cafeteria floor. Laughter erupted all around him, echoing in his ears like a cruel chorus. He bit back tears and picked himself up, determined not to give them the satisfaction of seeing him cry. The only reprieve David found was in his walks home. His route took him past an open field that led to the woods, a place he found strangely calming. The whispers of the wind through the trees and the distant rustle of wildlife made him feel connected to something greater, something that didn't judge him for his skin or his quiet nature. His mother had warned him to stay away from the forest, especially with the rumors of wolves roaming nearby, but David couldn't resist its pull. It was the only place where he felt free. One evening, after an especially brutal day at school, David decided to take the longer path home, one that cut closer to the woods. The sun was setting, casting golden rays across the horizon, and for the first time that day, he felt his shoulders relax. As he walked, he heard a faint sound like a low whine coming from deeper within the trees. He stopped, his heart pounding. The logical part of him told him to turn back, but curiosity won out. He followed the sound, stepping carefully over roots and branches until he found the source. Lying among the fallen leaves was a large wolf. Its fur was dark and matted with blood, and its breathing was shallow. David froze. He had never been this close to a wild animal before, and the sheer size of it was intimidating. The wolf opened its eyes, locking its golden gaze onto his. David expected it to growl or bare its teeth, but it just lay there, watching him. That's when he noticed the wound on its leg, a gunshot wound, still bleeding. David felt a surge of empathy. He knew what it was like to be hurt, to feel powerless. Gathering his courage, he took a step closer. The wolf's ears twitched, but it didn't move. Slowly, he removed his backpack and pulled out a water bottle. He poured some water into his hand and cautiously extended it toward the wolf. To his surprise, the animal lapped it up, its rough tongue brushing against his palm. Encouraged, David looked around and found a stick he could use to splint the injured leg. He tore strips from his shirt to secure the makeshift bandage. The entire time, the wolf stayed still, watching him with an intensity that sent shivers down his spine. When he finished, he sat back on his heels, unsure of what to do next. The wolf tried to stand but collapsed with a soft whimper. David realized it was too weak to move. Against his better judgment, he decided to help it further. He managed to lift the wolf onto an old tarp he found nearby and, with great effort, dragged it to an abandoned shed near his house. The shed became their secret meeting place. David brought food and water for the wolf every day, sneaking out before or after school. He tended to its wound, cleaning it and changing the bandages. Over time, the wolf grew stronger, its golden eyes watching David with what felt like understanding. In those quiet moments, sitting beside the wolf, David felt something he hadn't in a long time: companionship. The wolf didn't care about the color of his skin. It didn't mock him or judge him. It simply accepted him. David named the wolf Shadow, a nod to both its dark fur and the way it had silently entered his life. Shadow became his confidant, listening as David poured out his frustrations and fears. "You're lucky," he told Shadow one evening. "You don't have to deal with people. You don't have to prove anything to anyone." As Shadow's health improved, David knew the day would come when the wolf would return to the wild. He dreaded that moment, but he also knew it was inevitable. Shadow belonged to the forest, not to a small shed on the edge of town. For now, though, they had each other, and for David, that was enough. David woke up early each morning, earlier than usual, to check on Shadow before school. The wolf had grown stronger with each passing day, its golden eyes sharper, its movements steadier. David was careful to avoid being seen by anyone, especially his nosy neighbors. The shed was his and Shadow's secret, a place untouched by the cruelty of the outside world. At school, however, life was as unforgiving as ever. David's classmates seemed to take a special delight in targeting him. The taunts and jokes became crueler, more personal. One day, during gym class, the boys cornered him in the locker room. "What's it like, Kimber?" one sneered. "Do you scrub hard enough, or does that color not come off?" Another boy shoved him against a locker, and the rest laughed as David tried to keep his composure. He wanted to fight back, to defend himself, but he knew it would only make things worse. By the time he got home, his body ached, but the pain in his chest was worse. He slipped into the shed and sat down next to Shadow, who immediately perked up at his arrival. David let out a shaky breath and began talking, the words tumbling out like a flood. "They don't even see me as a person," he said, stroking Shadow's fur. "I could disappear tomorrow, and no one would care. No one except you." Shadow watched him intently, as if understanding every word. For the first time that day, David felt the knot in his chest loosen. He stayed there longer than usual, feeding Shadow scraps of meat he'd taken from dinner, before reluctantly heading back inside. The next day at school was worse. A group of boys had waited for him after class, and when they caught him alone in the hallway, they shoved him into the lockers, pinning him there. "What's wrong, Kimber? You scared?" one boy taunted. David clenched his fists, his anger bubbling just below the surface, but he knew better than to react. He kept his head down, his silence only fueling their laughter. When they finally let him go, he felt both relief and shame. He hated how powerless he felt, how he couldn't escape their hatred no matter what he did. At home, David tried to focus on his chores, but his mind kept drifting back to Shadow. He finished as quickly as he could and made his way to the shed. The wolf was lying on its side, but its ears twitched when David entered. He sat down beside it, resting his head on his knees. "I don't know how much longer I can take this," he admitted. "It's like they want me to feel like I don't belong anywhere." Shadow shifted, resting its head on David's lap. The simple gesture brought tears to his eyes. "You don't care, do you?" he whispered. "You don't care about what I look like. You just see me." The next few weeks followed a similar pattern. School was a battlefield, filled with taunts, shoves, and laughter at his expense. But the shed remained his sanctuary. Shadow's strength returned, and soon the wolf was able to stand and walk around. David knew the time was coming when Shadow would have to leave, but the thought filled him with dread. Shadow was the only friend he had, the only one who understood him. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, David sat in the shed watching Shadow pace back and forth. "You're getting better," he said softly. "Soon you'll be ready to go back to the forest." The words tasted bitter on his tongue. Shadow stopped pacing and looked at him, its golden eyes piercing. David wondered if the wolf could sense his reluctance. That night, as David lay in bed, he thought about what life would be like without Shadow. He thought about the long walks home, the silence that would greet him instead of the wolf's soft whines and steady presence. The thought made his chest ache. The next day, at school, things took a turn for the worse. During lunch, one of the boys grabbed David's backpack and dumped its contents onto the cafeteria floor. Books, notebooks, and pencils scattered everywhere. "Oops," the boy said with a smirk. "Didn't see you there, Shadow Boy." Laughter erupted around them, and David felt his face burn with humiliation. He bent down to gather his things, but another boy kicked his books out of reach. "Leave it," one of them said. "It's not like you're going anywhere anyway." David's hands trembled as he picked up his belongings, his mind racing with frustration and anger. He wanted to scream, to fight back, but he knew it would only make things worse. Instead, he bit his lip and walked away, clutching his backpack tightly to his chest. When he got home, he went straight to the shed. Shadow was waiting for him, his tail thumping softly against the ground. David sank to the floor beside it, burying his face in his hands. "I hate them," he said, his voice muffled. "I hate all of them." Shadow nudged him gently, its warm breath against his cheek. David looked up and met the wolf's gaze. "You're lucky," he said. "You don't have to deal with people. You don't have to prove anything." For the first time in weeks, David smiled, a small, fleeting smile that quickly faded. He knew Shadow's time with him was coming to an end. The wolf's strength had returned, and it was clear that it didn't belong in a shed. It belonged in the wild, where it could run free. But the thought of saying goodbye was almost too much to bear. That night, David made a decision. He would take Shadow back to the forest. It was the right thing to do, even if it meant losing the only friend he had. As he drifted off to sleep, he thought about the forest, about the freedom it represented, and about the wolf that had somehow become his lifeline. The morning air was colder than usual, the sun barely visible behind a veil of gray clouds. David stood in the shed, watching Shadow pace back and forth. The wolf's movements were stronger now, more fluid, and it was clear that its leg had healed. David knew what this meant, but the thought of letting Shadow go made his chest tighten. He knelt down, running his fingers through the wolf's dark fur. "You're ready, aren't you?" he said softly. Shadow stopped pacing and looked at him, tilting its head as if understanding the question. David swallowed hard, blinking back the tears that threatened to fall. "I'll take you back tonight." That day, David went through school feeling heavier than ever. The usual taunts and jeers from his classmates barely registered. He was too focused on what awaited him after sunset. When the final bell rang, he walked home slowly, his thoughts a tangled mess of emotions. Shadow had been his only source of comfort, his only friend in a world that seemed determined to crush him. Letting go felt like losing a part of himself. When night fell, David crept out of the house with Shadow following close behind. The wolf's movements were silent, its dark form blending into the shadows of the trees. They walked together, deeper into the forest, the crunch of leaves under David's feet the only sound. The further they went, the harder it became for David to keep going. He wanted to stop, to turn back, but he knew this was what Shadow needed. They reached a clearing surrounded by towering trees. The moonlight filtered through the branches, casting a soft glow on the ground. Shadow stopped and turned to look at David, its golden eyes reflecting the pale light. David knelt down, placing a hand on the wolf's side. "This is where we say goodbye," he whispered. His voice cracked, and a single tear rolled down his cheek. "Thank you for being there when I needed you." Shadow leaned into him, its warm breath brushing against his face. For a moment, David felt an overwhelming sense of peace. The wolf turned and began to walk away, its dark form disappearing into the shadows. David stayed in the clearing long after Shadow was gone, staring at the spot where it had vanished. He finally stood up, wiping his face with the sleeve of his jacket, and began the long walk home. The days that followed felt emptier than ever. David missed Shadow terribly, but he tried to focus on the little things that brought him joy: his books, the quiet walks home, and the few kind words from his neighbor, Patrick. He thought about Shadow often, wondering if the wolf had found its place in the wild, if it was safe and happy. One morning, David woke up feeling unusually tired. His throat itched and his chest felt tight, but he brushed it off as a cold. He went about his day as usual, forcing himself to eat breakfast before heading to school. By lunchtime, the tightness in his chest had worsened. He struggled to breathe, his vision blurring as he stumbled out of the cafeteria. His classmates watched, some laughing, others whispering among themselves, but no one offered to help. David barely made it home. By the time he reached his front door, his legs gave out, and he collapsed on the floor. Patrick, who had been waiting for him with a bag of groceries, rushed inside. "David!" he shouted, shaking his friend's shoulder. When David didn't respond, Patrick panicked and called for help. By the time the paramedics arrived, David's breathing had slowed to a faint rasp and his skin was cold to the touch. The town gathered for David's funeral a few days later. It was a somber event, held under a gray sky that threatened rain. Many of the townspeople came, some out of genuine sorrow, others out of morbid curiosity. Patrick stood at the front, his small hands clutching a bouquet of wildflowers. He couldn't stop crying, blaming himself for not noticing the signs earlier. "If I had known," he kept saying to himself, "if only I had known." As the service began, a low murmur rippled through the crowd. At first it was barely noticeable, but soon it grew louder, drawing everyone's attention. From the edge of the cemetery, a dark figure emerged. It was Shadow. The wolf moved slowly, its golden eyes fixed on the coffin. Gasps and whispers filled the air as Shadow approached, unbothered by the stunned faces around it. The wolf stopped in front of the coffin, standing motionless for a moment. Then, to everyone's shock, it leaned forward and gently bit David's neck. There was a collective gasp, followed by stunned silence. Moments later, something incredible happened. David's body jerked slightly, his chest rising as he took a deep, gasping breath. His eyes flew open, and he sat up, his face a mixture of confusion and relief. The crowd erupted into chaos, people shouting and stumbling backward. A local doctor rushed forward, checking David's pulse and examining his throat. "It's a miracle," he said, his voice trembling. "He wasn't dead. He must have gone into anaphylactic shock. The wolf's bite. It must have cleared his airway." David looked around, his mind struggling to piece together what had happened. His eyes landed on Shadow, who stood a few feet away, watching him silently. "Shadow," he whispered, his voice hoarse. The wolf turned and began to walk away, its dark form disappearing into the forest once again. The town buzzed with talk of the event for weeks. Many called it a miracle, while others dismissed it as coincidence. David, however, knew the truth. Shadow had saved him, just as the wolf had always been there when he needed help the most. When David returned home, he found himself looking toward the forest every night, hoping to catch a glimpse of his friend. Shadow never returned, but David felt the wolf's presence in everything he did. He carried the memory of their bond with him, a reminder that kindness and courage could bridge even the deepest divides. And so, David's life changed forever thanks to the unbreakable bond with his wolf friend. What do you think? Can animals truly understand and repay kindness? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell for more heartwarming stories like this one.